Economics correspondent for Reuters told LBC the forecasts are based on a scenario that has already been diluted slightly.
Underpinning the assumptions that the IMF used for its forecasts was the full sort of onslaught, as it were, of President Donald Trump's tariffs announcement on April the 2nd. They didn't have time to include his sort of rowing back of much of those tariffs.
Prince William will go to the funeral of Pope Francis in place of the King. It will take place in St Peter's Square on Saturday morning, with world leaders, including the Prime Minister, also attending. Sir Keir Starmer's welcomed the Supreme Court's ruling on the definition of a woman. The Prime Minister says he believes the decision that it should be based on biological sex provides real clarity. And British Steel's ending a consultation process on up to 2,700 redundancies. It follows the government's takeover of the business. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 52 points, 83.28. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.16. LBC weather: dry for much of Scotland and northern England tonight. Rain in Northern Ireland moving southeastwards across central and southern England and Wales. A low of 1 degree. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. And don't forget, if you ever miss an edition of Cross Question, you can catch up on Global Player in vision or indeed on audio. And you can also catch the Cross Question podcast, which is released about 11 p.m. each Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. Joining me on my panel, to my left, Tessa Khan, international climate change lawyer, who's the founder and executive director of the clean energy campaign Uplift. To her left, Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK and MP for Boston and Skegness. And to my right, Adrian Ramsay, co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales and MP for Waveney Valley. And to his right, Michael Liebreich, who is Chief Executive of the clean energy and transport consultancy Liebreich Associates and the co-host of the podcast Cleaning Up. Today is World Earth Day, so we want to have all of your questions on environmental issues and climate change. 0345 6060 973. You can call us and WhatsApp us on that number, and you can text 84850 and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, I wonder how many of us know what World Earth Day is. Well, Adrian Ramsay will tell us, won't you, Adrian?
I will do my best. Yeah, well, it's a day to celebrate and recognise the environment, one that's been going since 1970, inspired by a UNESCO conference, and does, in countries across the world, inspire discussion about how we care for the natural world, as it's clearly done with LBC tonight.
And aren't we all supposed to turn off our lights for an hour or something? They've done that in previous years, haven't they?
That was one of the ways it was marked. But there's been a variety of different things that have been used at different times to draw attention to it.
Right, well, we're looking forward to your questions. The first one comes from James in Hitchin. It's a WhatsApp question. Is Nigel Farage right that net zero is the new Brexit? Well, Richard Tice, I have to come to you first on that.
Yes, he's 100% correct, James, and I think the next general election will be fought around the implications of net zero, the costs, the damage it's doing to our economy, our industries, how it's impoverishing ordinary people on low incomes, modest incomes up and down the country. And I think if we see that energy prices, electricity prices don't go down as this government has promised, whether it's by £300 or whatever, but actually go up, some are predicting it'll go up by up to £900 per annum per household. If that happens, then it'll be a net zero election and we will win it.
Is it net zero that you object to, or the timetable?
It's actually, look, I'm all for using technology for cleaner air, cleaner filters and the like. I enjoy it. I've got a Tesla. I'm very lucky. It's a great piece of kit. I don't like noise, so I quite like the silence of an electric car. But what I object to is that ordinary people have been misinformed that this will lead to lower bills. It's not. It's leading to higher bills, and it's destroying industries like the car industry, like the steel industry we've been just talking about in the House of Commons. It's destroying the chemicals industry in this country, the oil and gas industry. It's destroying growth, and it's making everybody poorer as we outsource our industry and CO2 emissions elsewhere in the world where the regulations are less strict and stringent than here. And essentially, look, we represent about, give or take, 1% of CO2 emissions in the world. But at the same time, other economies, particularly in Asia and the US, are growing very, very fast. And they've got cheap energy, and that's what you need. In order to be competitive, you need cheap energy. The US is drill, baby, drill, and they've got electricity prices a quarter of ours, gas prices a third of ours, and guess what? They're growing much faster than us.
But Brexit was an issue which I think people genuinely did talk about down the dog and duck. I'm not sure net zero has the resonance with people. Or are you going to make sure it does?
Well, what people talk about down the dog and duck, and pubs and clubs and bus stops and on the touch lines up and down the country, is the cost of our bills, the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, the cost of living, and the two are directly linked. It is the greatest source of the growth in bills and the cost of living, and that penny is dropping with people. People are becoming ever more aware of it, and it's really concerning people.
OK. Adrian?
Well, I think that Richard's approach is deeply irresponsible, and in answering that, I want to draw inspiration from Pope Francis, who we're commemorating at the moment, and one of his most famous writings was about humanity's relationship with the environment, and he wrote that the destruction of the natural environment endangers us all as human beings, and especially the most vulnerable. And of course, he was talking about the most vulnerable around the world, and the most vulnerable in Western countries. And that's why we've got to take action, fundamentally. We've got to lead the world into a green industrial revolution with all of the jobs and business and bill-saving opportunities that provides.
But
in doing so,
jobs.
Well, let's do it in the right way. I mean, the green economy in the UK is growing 3 times faster than the economy as a whole. And if we get the right policy frameworks in place that enable us to realise those business opportunities, we will see that. What we're not seeing from this government is an adequate focus on how we reduce energy use, policies like a nationwide programme to insulate people's homes that will bring bills down, a focus on renewable energy, which is the cheapest way of producing electricity. So we've got to make sure that we get behind this programme because there are huge economic opportunities, because it's the right way to lead the world, but because it's the right thing for Britain. I don't want to see the most vulnerable people in the UK suffering in the way that people around the world are doing with wildfires, with increased flooding. We've got to take that action. It's the right thing morally, but it's the right thing economically as well.
Tessa Khan.
So I don't think net zero is the new Brexit because there is a huge level of public support for action on climate change across this country, regardless of demographic, regardless of voting attention, regardless of where you live. You know, people really care about the world that they're leaving for their children and their grandchildren. There is also plenty of polling to show that people also associate more renewable energy with cheaper household energy bills, with cheaper electricity. And that's because all of the evidence is clear that the thing that drove up our energy bills after Russia invaded Ukraine, the reason that the UK had among the highest household energy bills in all of Europe is because of our exceptional dependency on gas to heat our homes. It's because of the proportion of gas that forms our electricity. And that is what is causing people's increase in energy bills. And if you ask UK Steel, for example, if you ask businesses, they will tell you that their energy bills are being driven by the wholesale cost of gas. And we know that in the long run, the fastest way to make sure that we bring down energy bills and electricity prices for good is transitioning to renewable energy, which we happen to have in abundance in the UK.
But before the war in Ukraine, renewables were more expensive than gas and oil.
Well, renewables have been coming down in price as a technology year on year at least for the last decade. I mean, the price drops have been astonishing. Something like solar power's dropped about 80% in cost in the last 10 years as a technology. I mean, this is, again, a result of the fact that it's a technology and it's not something we've got to rely on other countries to dig out of the ground. They can restrict that supply when it suits them. It makes us dependent on countries that aren't our allies. It is an entirely different approach to an energy system, and the UK is in an amazing position to take advantage of that because, as I said, we've got some of the best wind energy resources in Europe, and that's also why, you know, if you look at places like Hull, they've opened up a new wind turbine factory where they're hiring 1,300 people. You know, there's a new subsea cable factory in Scotland that's also looking to hire another 900 people. This is where the jobs are being created. We could do a lot more to make sure that the jobs for manufacturing, the wind industry, kit that's required are all kept in the UK, but it is absolutely the economic opportunity of the century for us.
Richard, you were shaking your head so much there, I thought it might come off.
This is just delusional. We've got the most expensive electricity in the developed world. tens and tens of thousands of jobs across the country are being destroyed by the cost of energy. And the jobs that Tessa's just referred to there, it's a fraction of the jobs that are being lost as industry is basically legging it out of the UK. And if you care about people on low incomes, on vulnerable people, then actually you've got to make people better off. And you don't make people better off if you give them higher energy bills, higher electricity prices. And I just refer to the simple fact that gas prices and electricity prices in the US are between a quarter and a third of our prices. Why? Because they use their own gas, their own shale gas. They're now exporting shale gas here. We've got our own gas. We should be using our own gas. Okay. Lots of it as fast as we can.
Michael.
So I think let's take a step back to the, is net zero the next Brexit? I think energy costs could well be the deciding issue for the next election. But to elide, just to say that, well, the energy costs are high and it is therefore a net zero. Net zero is the driver and is the cause. That's just simply wrong. So what we've got is we do have the highest electricity costs across the major economies. But the fact is, Tessa is right, it is driven by gas. Gas sets the price for electricity for 98% of the time in the UK. Right? No other country in the developed world has gas setting the price 98% of the time. So gas produces 26% of our electricity, sets the price 98% of the time, and it's very expensive. And to say that this is...
It's not.
Well, so it's very interesting. We have this completely dysfunctional now design of our power markets where across the country you have one electricity price. That's completely ridiculous because what you've got is a lot of cheap electricity that's being generated when it's windy in the north, for instance. But we can't get that to the south. So what happens is we pay to shut off wind turbines in the north, and then we pay to generate with gas in the south. So what you've got...
my point. Renewables plus backup must cost more than
Richard,
backup.
let me explain, because clearly what you're saying, you've made a... this is just fallacious to say that the reason we've got high electricity costs is because of
You do realise there's almost £15 billion worth of subsidies to the renewables industry.
Do you know what? Can I just finish what I'm saying, right? So 26% of our generation, but the problem is somewhere in the country at any time, there's a gas turbine that needs to run to keep the lights on, and it's expensive, and it sets the price of electricity. And then on top of that, we put the green charges and the green levies not onto the thing that causes the CO2 emissions, which is now not coal anymore. We've closed the last coal, but it's gas. So instead of putting those costs onto gas, we put it onto electricity. Now, electricity is the...
Who makes that decision?
Well, that's the structure of the market. So the market design after privatization of energy and the restructuring and the separation of transmission from retail utilities, from generation. There was all these reforms that were done. At that time, what happened, there were no renewables. There was some nuclear, which produces very cheap electricity. The marginal cost of nuclear is very low. Once you've got it, it's very cheap to produce. So you wanted that running. And then you have this system which brought in other resources in the order of cost, right? So the next cheapest, which at the time was coal, and then CCGT, these big central gas stations, and then peakers, right? The problem is our electricity mix has completely changed, right? With now 50% is actually clean energy, it's either renewables or nuclear, and the system is still trying to sort of dispatch it. It's trying to send out the electricity in effectively the wrong order. It's just a dysfunctional system.
But you do accept there's almost £15 billion a year of subsidies to the renewable industry, which is being paid for by the British consumer. Right?
Can I tell you a secret?
That is why all our bills are higher.
No, can I tell you?
Without the subsidies, the renewables are not viable, as you well know.
Right. So first of all, you're shifting to a different issue.
No, it's the same issue because someone has to pay those subsidies.
And excuse me, in the grand scheme of how much the UK pays for energy, 15 billion is not.
You're saying 15 billion doesn't matter?
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying that it cannot conceivably explain why our energy costs are higher than anybody else. Now, you've done another thing there, Richard, which is that you've said the US is cheaper because it has its own gas. And what you're doing is you're planting the seed of an idea that the UK somehow has enough of its own gas.
We've just discovered a new gas field that would last 10 years, decades worth of UK gas supply in my county of North Lincolnshire.
And do you know what? We're connected to the European gas markets. So by the time
why does the US have its own gas price?
My thought.
Because you produce it and sell it in your own country.
We'll get the headmaster here stepping in and telling us.
Oh no, I'm enjoying it.
So. We are connected to the European gas market, right? What that means is anything we find, anything we try and extract in the UK is shared by the market. It can be sold. It'll be sold to whoever pays the highest price.
Doesn't have
right?
to be.
Excuse me. That's the way the market works, right?
Why doesn't it work like that way in the US? We could set our own market.
The US has limited.
We're not linked to the EU anymore. We haven't actually left the EU.
The US has limited through the amount of LNG liquefaction capacity in how much it can export, and a few pipelines here and there. So what happens is a lot of what the US extracts is, I don't want to say dumped, but it stays within the US. We don't have that, right? We have huge capacity to export because we used to have the North Sea.
Can I add? Yes, just on the North Sea.
Tessa
Can I just
before
bring
it becomes the Tice and Liebreich show?
Indeed, if I could just interject, just on the North Sea specifically, because I spent a lot of time actually looking at the projections for oil and gas production from the North Sea. Even if you were to, because the reality is that the North Sea's best days are decades behind it. It is an ultra mature basin. That is a matter of geology. It's not politics. If you were to issue more new licences for the North Sea, according to the oil and gas regulator itself, it would only add about 4 days worth of additional gas demand per year between now and 2050. And that's just because we've burnt most of the stuff that's actually easy to extract, unless you provide massive subsidies to the oil and gas sector to make it commercial to extract more. It simply isn't going to be. And we all know what happens when you end up subsidising the oil and gas sector. You get cries from the British public for a windfall tax because it's just not right that these companies make huge profits when people have high energy bills. So the fact is that, again, I can give you another example, which is that in the last decade under the Conservative government, we issued hundreds of new oil and gas licences. That has led to a handful of new fields being discovered, which will produce over their lifetime 3 weeks worth of gas, about 5 weeks worth of oil. 80% of that oil, like 80% of all of the oil that we produce in the North Sea, ends up being exported. It is not contributing to UK energy security, neither is the majority of our gas production.
It contributes to the UK economy. I'd have thought that was a good enough reason to do it.
Well, again, this is an industry that is in terminal decline. So even with hundreds of...
Well, it is if it's talked down by you all the time.
No. This is a matter of geology, Ian. That's what I'm saying. It's not politics. It's not policy.
Not to speak to the industry experts, and we've got a decade's worth in Lincolnshire that's just been discovered. Maybe other discoveries might be made.
But you wanted to say talk to the experts, right? So talk to the geologists. Understand, please, the difference between finding a resource and a proven reserve. You've got if at best from fracking under the UK, you've got enough for 10 years of UK supply. At best. By the time you
Not what my experts tell me, but carry on.
Well, you maybe have. I'm sure you have wonderful experts amongst your members who want to reinforce this narrative that the problem. So
enjoyable though this is, we are commercial radio, and that demands that we do have to go to a break at some point, and this is that point. It's 90 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
It's World Earth Day, and we are taking questions on climate change and the environment with Adrian Ramsay, co-leader of the Green Party, Richard Tice, deputy leader of Reform UK, Tessa Khan, international climate change lawyer, and Michael Liebreich. He hosts the podcast Cleaning Up. Now, what is this podcast? Because it's not an exciting title, is it?
No, but you've got to, got to pluck a title out of the air. So what I do is I talk to just people who've been deeply engaged in mainly on the energy side or the transport side of clean technologies. So the transition to net zero, over whatever period you want. And I've had the privilege of meeting just a lot of people working on it, and I kind of go up and down the stack from. I don't know, I'm sort of pointing to the top of the stack, Tony Blair and Prince Albert of Monaco and Mark Carney now.
What does Prince Albert of Monaco know about the
He's
price of
got a
fish?
huge foundation doing lots of work on oceans, and oceans are kind of important for all of this. So, but then, Mark Carney now PM of Canada, reasonably important figure in climate action and finance and so on, even before his elevation just recently. But I go all the way down to material science experts in AI, quantum computing, and we talk about what are the inevitable shift to cleaner energy.
I want a Tice Liebreich podcast. That's what I'm aiming to get out of this hour. Right, let's go to Geraldine in Putney. Geraldine, what would you like to say?
Yes. What drastic steps are going to be taken to control the crisis that's happening on the earth? How can we control
what do you mean, what steps? What steps that we should each take?
The global crisis,
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what drastic changes do we all need to make to stop the climate crisis? Adrian?
Well, it is a crisis, and we need governments to be acting in a way that recognises that. And I think too often we see policies that either don't recognise the urgency or even are taking us in completely the wrong direction. And it does involve a reimagining of how we can deliver an economy that's much better for people and for planet. So, for example, the recent debates around the trade wars, and I'd be the first to criticise Donald Trump throwing his weight around using bully boy tactics and so on. And I want to see us work closely with our nearest trading partners, particularly in Europe, to form alliances to resist that. But at the same time, whilst we've got to address the immediate challenge, we also have a huge opportunity here to make the UK more resilient, to build jobs, build markets, build manufacturing and food growing opportunities that will make us more resilient to these changes in the international climate, to wars, to climate breakdown. We're not resilient enough at the moment. The scenes we saw during COVID of empty supermarket shelves could become all too common if climate breakdown takes hold, and we haven't invested in that more resilient future. So I think the urgency of the situation that Geraldine talks about is not being reflected in political debate. But what about things
that we as individuals should do? Because I read an article some time ago that said, frankly, it doesn't matter what individuals can do. We make no difference whatsoever. It's what governments can do.
Well, I do think there is a danger in having too much focus on individual action, because the systemic changes that we need to see do need to happen at government level. If you take a very simple example, I want it to be the cheapest, most convenient option for people to take public transport rather than flying. For example, if you were going from south of the UK to Scotland, I want it to be cheaper to fly than cheaper to get the train than to fly. And it's the wrong way around at the moment. The incentives are not in the right way. We need to set up the economy where the greener option is the cheaper option. And that applies across the board, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's supporting our farmers to produce more food locally, whether it's making sure that we're restoring nature and really valuing our natural resources that are in decline. So I do think the systemic government policies are where the primary focus needs to be.
Michael?
There's a lot we can do as individuals, both in terms of things that don't even impact on our standard of living. Lots of things we can do. The chief ones are around heating, around transportation. So electrify heating, electrify transportation. We're now at the point where, frankly, on a cost basis, those are a wash, and we can do those. we've reached, it's an interesting situation where we kind of say, oh, well, but why would we do that without government action, government subsidy, government? There's actually a lot that we can just do ourselves. And I'm just struck by lots of the kind of Just Stop Oil type protesters who will go off and protest but haven't switched to a green tariff and a heat pump themselves. And I'm not going to sit here and get into a tit for tat on whether these are good people or bad people, but it is enormously striking that so many people think that it's only up to governments and not up to individuals, and it's clearly up to both. But what I would say is that I do also want to push back on this idea that it's an urgent crisis to the point where we have to sort of throw all economic caution, that this is the overriding crisis. We actually have decades to deal with it. So globally, we will take 3, 4, 5 decades, and we will reach net zero, not just because there'll be some global government and Klaus Schwab says at the World Economic Forum that we must, but we will get to net zero because, frankly, burning stuff is pretty dumb. It's dumb thermodynamically, it's dumb economically, and it's dumb for the planet. And so we will get off that, and it will not be as fast as we would like it to be, certainly not as fast as you'd like it to be, Adrian. As leader of the Green Party, you have to, create this kind of feeling that there's a crisis, because otherwise to justify the whole program.
I'm backing the science, actually.
Well, but the science. No, sorry, but if you're going to back the science, then back the science, right? Which says that, Paris Agreement, 2 degrees, which means essentially getting to net zero by around the end of the century would be. Excuse me, that's what the science says. Look at what the model is. Hang on, we are currently on track to get around 2.5 degrees of warming. Right? Look at what the IPCC says, what the great reports on this stuff, what they actually say about how much damage there would be at 2.5 degrees. It's not global collapse of all the harvests. It's not more than a meter, which is very bad. By the way, I'm somebody who thinks this stuff is very bad. A meter of sea level rise, and I'm a skier and a climber, and all the glaciers melting. It's not something I'm happy with. But to suggest that it is somehow the end of the economy, the end of the planet, the end of all the ecosystems on the planet, if we're at 2.5 degrees, it's just wrong.
Let's bring in Tessa.
Well, I tend to agree with Adrian that, it's a question of whether or not you have the means to make the right choices at the moment that are really determinative of whether or not you can. So, of course, if you can afford to switch to a heat pump, if you can afford to buy an EV, then by all means do that. It's clear that that's the right thing to do. It's also the better consumer choice. Richard has a Tesla, as we've heard.
I just bought an electric car at the weekend.
Another one?
Well, yeah.
You had one and ditched it because you didn't like it.
Yes, but the range has got so much better now. So, but we'll see if that works.
Right, so there are all sorts of reasons. Heat pumps also just make for a better heating experience.
They're a disaster in old houses. They don't work unless it's a new house.
1865 house, coefficient of performance of 5. This is just wrong.
You're just wrong. I've literally had constituents in tears begging me, how do they get this heat pump out of the house that they were missold, that doesn't work? She was freezing cold in January. I'm sorry, you're just completely and utterly wrong on this.
I'm so sorry you have a bad install.
Right or wrong.
But hang on, you can't take an example of a bad installation. And by the way, there are many,
ran a radio show and I had dozens of people telling me that their heat pumps didn't work, they regret installing them. Look,
and I have a podcast and I have dozens of people who say they've got marvellous experiences with heat pumps.
And you've never had anyone say that they haven't had a marvellous
I've had a bad experience with a heat pump because it was badly installed and I reinstalled it. So we have a real problem of skills. Installing
and mis-selling.
And mis-selling. But
let's hear Richard's answer.
Mis-selling boilers, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, look, climate change has always been real for millions of years. In my view, it always will be. This idea that you can somehow stop climate change by getting to net zero. I would just remind everybody that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that if you get to net zero tomorrow, it'll take somewhere between 200 years and 1,000 years for sea level rise to stop rising. So they say that with high confidence, which is of course reassuring. Maybe the better thing to do is to adapt to climate change, which is real. I think it's arrogant to think that you can stop the power of the sun, arrogant to think you can stop the power of volcanoes. We should adapt to it. We've got sea level defence issues in my constituency of Boston Skegness in the next 20 years. We can't wait for 200 years. We need to deal with them smartly, sensibly, where there's risks, like you did, for example, with the Thames Barrier 30 or 40 years ago. That's how you do. You adapt to climate change. You don't think you can stop it and impoverish a nation in the process.
Can I surprise you and slightly agree with some of that? Because actually, adaptation to the changes we're already seeing in the climate and the changes that are already locked in has got to be part of the policy answer here, and we can and must have a reasonable discussion about what that looks like. Flood management, including natural ways of flood management, which don't get near enough attention, could have a lot more focus. The thing is, though, Richard, if we at the same time allow climate change to go unchecked, the degree of change that we will see in the decades to come, we could debate exactly when that happens, but in the decades to come will be huge in terms of breakdown of our food system, in terms of flooding, in terms of impact on farmers and so on, extreme weather. So it's not an either or. Yes, we do need to do more to adapt. That doesn't get anywhere near enough attention in Parliament. We would both maybe like to hear it discussed more in Parliament, but that's not a reason not to also step up the action to dramatically reduce emissions. We have to do both.
What I think is interesting, is from your point of view, Richard, is that, up until recently, you had 3 MPs with coastal constituencies, but one of them, we won't go into that.
He's still an MP of a coastal constituency.
Yeah, but I mean, like Rupert Lowe, Great Yarmouth, Nigel Farage in Clacton, and you in Boston and Skegness. I mean, coastal erosion is a massive issue. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that you don't deny climate change, which I think 10 years ago, people coming from your perspective really were seen as.
And so I want to challenge, I'm challenging the Environment Agency, for example, to deseal rivers, which we've got a lot of ditches and drains in my constituency, so that actually, coming back to sort of partly agreeing with Adrian, you need better management of the rivers, of natural plains, to use that as opportunities to de-risk the threats to homes and businesses. I mean, I just had homes flooded in Boston recently because of mismanagement by the Environment Agency, not because of the huge quantity of rain or climate change. So I think better management, better adaptation, and better technology. Technology is a great thing.
I feel my work is done here, bringing Adrian and Richard together in agreement. Maybe we should finish now and quit while we're ahead. But we do have another half an hour for your questions to our panel. It's 8:32. News headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
The International Monetary Fund has warned worldwide economic growth will slow as a result of trade wars, but the body says the UK will be among those worst affected as it revised its growth estimate down to 1.1% from 1.6%. Kensington Palace has revealed Prince William will be among those to attend the late Pope's funeral on Saturday. He'll take the place of the King, who met Pope Francis earlier this month during a trip to Italy. And there'll be a full inquiry into the Nottingham attacks in 2023. 3 people were stabbed to death by Valdo Calacane, who'd had extensive contact with NHS mental health teams. LBC weather: dry for much of Scotland and northern England tonight. Rain in Northern Ireland moving southeastwards across central and southern England and Wales. A low of 1 degree.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
25 to 9 on this World Earth Day special edition of Cross Question with co-leader of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsay, Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK, Tessa Khan, international climate change lawyer, and Michael Liebreich, the host of the podcast Cleaning Up. And he also runs, he's Chief Executive of the clean energy and transport consultancy Liebreich Associates. A text question from Simon, who says, will the panel agree with me that the best way to grow the economy is to build, and environmental regulations have gone way too far in holding back growth for far too long? Tessa Khan.
Well, I mean, I think I disagree with the premise of the question in that I think, the net zero economy actually involves building a lot of stuff, and we are very pro building, for example, more manufacturing capacity in the UK for things like wind turbines, for subsea cables. These are all things that will contribute to growth, create jobs, and that are good for the environment. I think there's been a worrying trend recently for the government to scapegoat environmental regulation as being the reason that we're not building enough housing. Everybody that I know who works for an environmental campaign group wants more housing. We all want more affordable housing. There are all sorts of things that have held that back for a long time, including supply chains, things that don't have anything to do with environmental regulations. But there is a way to do these things that are both good for the environment and also achieve our growth targets, whether that's housing or industry or anything else. And I think, the thing that we've got to remember is that the UK public, people really don't enjoy having their local environments polluted. The water sewage crisis has been one of the things that has brought people together, that has created huge amounts of outrage, more than any other issue recently. And that's because people value their green spaces. They love living close to nature. They love having clean air to breathe, hearing birds sing, seeing nature thriving. Those are all things that people want as well. And there are ways of doing both. But they don't want
£100 million bat tunnels, do they?
I knew it was going to come back to the bat tunnel.
Sorry to be so predictable.
Yeah, I mean, the bat tunnel is the one iconic example that we hear about time and time again.
But it is ridiculous, isn't it?
Well, I wasn't involved in any of the negotiation around
it's my pet
HS2.
topic. And yet the boss of HS2, he's no remorse at all. He said he would do it again. I mean, it's utterly ludicrous, and it's that sort of thing that drives everybody mad. I mean, coming back to Simon's question, yes, we do need to build more, but the reasons we're not building enough at the moment is a combination of regulations, partly environmental, but there's lots of other regulations. If you're in central Vauxhall and you're building a 50-storey tower, including affordable housing, you don't need to do lots of surveys for bats, folks. I mean, it's just ludicrous. I've literally been involved in it. So the time and cost and surveys for getting...
Because you have a property development background.
I had real estate is my background, building homes and commercial property. So yeah, there is a major problem with the cost of building, including, I'll come back to it, the cost of energy, but not everything. And so, yeah, I mean, building things is a great driver of growth, including, you're touching about infrastructure, transport infrastructure of all the different types. And if we build more, then yes, that's a really good thing.
But would you advocate a sort of Elon Musk Doge-style axing of all of these environmental regulations, or do you accept that there has to be some controls?
I'm in favour of smart regulations as opposed to daft regulations, and having to do lots of, I know it sounds a bit silly, but lots of bat surveys in the middle of a brownfield site in the middle of central London just is daft. But it goes on and on and on, and it's a serious block on investment and growth. And lots of real estate investors and developers, they're saying it's too difficult in the UK now. It's just too hard to get a planning consent. And so I'm not going to bother, I'm going to go elsewhere. And that's the real concern.
Michael?
I think the premise of the question is correct. It is just much too hard to build things. So building will drive the economy. It's one of the most important drivers. Clearly, we are massively short of housing. We're massively short of all the infrastructure. We also need to build things like pylons. And, that's something that, it's all very well to say we want to have net zero and...
Put them underground.
At 5 times the cost.
No, it's not 5 times the cost when you pay the property compensation, Michael.
I know that's your policy.
You have to pay the compensation.
Okay. At 5 times the cost, you can put pylons underground, and you can put a few kilometres in sensitive, Waveney or wherever. You can do that. But fundamentally, if we're going to make these changes, we're going to have to build a lot of stuff across the board. I think there's a lot more. There's a lot of. It's not just environmental regulation, though. A lot of it is just plain old NIMBYism, and people use the environmental regulations and find ways of applying them to stop things they don't like.
You're a very interesting character, you know. Because I can't predict what you're going to say in answer to any question.
I'm sorry, making your job hard.
No, not at all. I think it's fascinating.
I'm trying to argue for a sensible centre, right? I'm trying to argue that the sun does not cause climate change, right? The reason it doesn't cause climate change is because it hasn't changed in the last 200 years, but the temperature has changed, right? So I'm going to argue against this misinformation on climate.
You're not going off the subject.
But I'm also going to argue against the sort of extremes of environmental sort of the scare stories, the giving children anxiety attacks about climate, this thesis that everything's going to collapse if we don't do X and Y and Z and it's all top down. I'm a conservative, right? I just happen to be a conservative who understands that there are planetary boundaries. I happen to understand thermodynamics, physics, engineering, and, a fair amount of climate science.
Adrian, Ramsay?
Well, I don't think anyone's into scaremongering. I'm certainly into listening to the United Nations, who literally saying it's code red for humanity in terms of what the action that needs to be taken. So
Excuse me,
a matter of taking
that's the UN Secretary General. That's not what the IPCC says.
Well,
There's no the words code red do not appear in the IPCC report.
We should listen to the UN Secretary General. But in terms of the question about building, I'm really fed up with the debate around do we want to build or do we not want to build. The question, as Tessa says, is what do we want to build? What do we need to build for a greener future that's better for people and planet? There's lots of things that need to be built, whether it's more affordable housing, whether it's renewable energy, more wind turbines, whether it's better public transport. We need to make sure the right things are being built. But the idea that you can just tear away environmental regulation and that's how somehow going to be better for society is ridiculous. I mean, the environment is not the blocker to new housing, and neither are local councils. There are over 1 million homes.
Well, with respect, they are. The planning departments can be blockers.
Well, let me highlight this. Across the country, there are 1 million homes that have planning permission but have not been built. The developers are sitting on the land, speculating, land banking, trying to make money out of not building. That's over 1 million homes, when the government's whole target for new housing is 1.5 million. The government treats this like a game of GDP of how can we help give a blank cheque to the private property developers rather than how do we actually meet the affordable housing need. So that's got to be the focus, being tougher with developers.
But one
other point, Richard. We know you're an ex-developer. I had a group of ecologists come to my constituency recently who highlighted that the government's planning reforms, if they are not amended in some crucial ways that the Green Party's putting forward at the bill committee stage, will seriously undermine crucial environmental protections in what is now one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. We have got to take nature restoration seriously if we are serious about a sustainable food future, clean air, clean water. Nature is crucial for our well-being as a people, as well as for our enjoyment of the natural world.
So as a former developer, I mean, for example, putting in heat bumps into a new home is about 4 times more than putting a good old-fashioned boiler, for example. Having said that, actually, I think Adrian and I would probably agree, we probably should put solar panels on the roofs of new homes. That's a good use of roof space. But too many of those million homes with planning consent you refer to, Adrian, it's actually not viable for the developers to build them because the cost of building with all of the extra regulations, and you're right, it's not actually primarily the environmental regulations, lots of others, that just makes it not viable. And that's a major issue that we've got to deal with.
Right, let's move on. We'll come to more questions in just a moment. It's coming up to 8:45 on LBC.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:46 is the time on LBC. Adrian, Ramsay, Richard, Tice, Tessa Khan and Michael Liebreich with me answering your questions. Tyler's in Leeds. Hello, Tyler.
Hey, Mr. Dale, and I'm actually in Whitby today. I've been vampire hunting.
As you do.
No, apologies. But my question to the panel is, what role do they see regional mayors having in sort of driving the green economy and bringing in good jobs that can fight climate change? Like I know around the eastern parts of Yorkshire, there's a lot of carbon capture investment coming in. So I think regional mayors can sort of play a role in sort of helping give jobs to people and sort of fix some of the problems that you've been discussing tonight. Thank you.
Well, there are lots of regional mayoral elections taking place on the 1st of May, which is only next Thursday, can you believe? Adrian, let's start with you.
I think that Tyler's absolutely right, that the role of regional mayors and other strategic civic leaders have a huge beneficial impact in terms of climate and the green job creation that can go with that. If you look at the renewable energy opportunities, for example, there's huge opportunity to promote offshore wind in particular, with big benefits that will create for jobs. And equally, we could be doing far more manufacturing of things like heat pumps, as we've talked about, investing in the skills shortages that we know we have, that Michael and others have talked about tonight.
But what can regional mayors do about that?
Well, what they can do is to generate the investment, work with investors, work with companies, but at the same time, crucially, work with colleges to make sure you're producing the skills that are going to match those job opportunities. And if you do those two things in tandem, that's where it can be really strong for generating a green economic future.
Michael?
Yeah, I think regional mayors can be incredibly important because what they can do is they won't be able to create joined up policy all by themselves up and down the stack right the way through to the kind of national level, but they can bring together skills, education, the local colleges, the companies. They can put pressure on various energy companies. They have a lot of impact on planning. So if you're going to take advantage of this trend, then you do need that joined up thinking, and it is hard to do at the central government level, and so I think they've got a big role to play. I'm not sure. I could go down the rabbit hole of CCS, carbon capture and storage.
No,
we'll be
not.
doing a bit of that, but I would not. If I was a regional mayor, I would be probably soft pedaling on that one. But that's a different discussion.
Tessa.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Adrian and Michael said about the role of regional mayors. I just want to reiterate that this is really the levelling up opportunity that we have been looking for. You know, the net zero economy, the places that have been deindustrialised that desperately need investment, whether that's, you know, the northeast of Scotland, where the oil and gas industry is declining despite, you know, everyone's best efforts to keep licensing it. That's a sector that's lost about 200,000 jobs that have been supported by it in the last decade, when, you know, the UK government had a policy of maximising economic recovery of oil and gas. And that's, as I said, because of geology. So we need jobs in the northeast of Scotland. We need jobs in Humber, Tyneside, you know, the south of Wales. These are all places where we could have industry if we have the right skills support so that people can retrain, if we partner with businesses, as others have said. So I think it is a massive levelling up opportunity that can actually be realised this time around.
Richard?
Yeah, a good regional mayor actually can be a fantastic force for good in an area. For example, as I think Michael was saying, sort of unblocking things where things get sort of stuck in the logjam of planning or whatever, banging heads together, having a vision, how you get people to work together, whether it's a vision for attracting a business into an area, getting councils, for example, to release brownfield sites. There are so many brownfield sites that are just redundant because it's a bit more expensive to build on them. And I think, you know, that's something we'd all try to do. If we could use our brownfield sites much more for building more homes and things, that means you're using less fields. That must be something everybody could sort of coalesce around. And those are the sort of areas where actually regional mayors can make a real difference.
Michael, I have this distant memory that you were interested in becoming Mayor of London once, replacing Boris Johnson. Is that a wicked rumour, or might you be interested in exercising these powers yourself one day?
It is true. 2015, I thought of standing as Boris moved on to pastures much more important, and I did think about it. At the time, there were no viable Conservative candidates in the race. And I'd been on the board of Transport for London, and I thought that I'd have a crack at it, and I got quite far through the process. And at the time, Zach Goldsmith had said that he didn't want to stand earlier, but I think Boris lent on him, and I lent on him as well, because I thought he'd be a much better candidate than me.
How wrong you were?
Well, who knows? There's a parallel universe somewhere where I'm in my third term as Mayor of London, and we've reached net zero, and everybody's prosperous, and the trains run on time, and there was no Sandylands catastrophe and all sorts of things.
OK, let's go to Ben in Clacton. Hi, Ben.
Hello, Ian, and panel. My question is, why are we paying power companies to turn off wind turbines, 230 million a year, when Greg Jackson is saying if you did keep them on, then we would have the cheapest electricity in Europe?
And he's the head of Octopus Energy. Richard?
Well, it's a good question. The reality is because very often there's an issue between the supply of the renewable energy, which is often mainly offshore, often in the North Sea in Scotland, and actually the demand for it is in the population centres. And there's a mismatch, particularly when it's too windy, and you then have to turn them off for a bunch of reasons. And so you're paying out constraint payments, which I think actually are way more than just a couple of $100 million. I mean, they're heading towards 750, possibly $1 billion. So, yeah, it's a major issue, and it's one of the reasons why actually we've got these high subsidies and why the cost of renewable energy is not as cheap as everybody makes out, because you've got this issue of constraint payments.
Well, the figure I've got here is 1.8 billion, so it's even more than you were suggesting. Tessa?
Well, I mean, I think Michael looks like he's got something to say on
are you ceding your time to him?
I actually am going to cede my time to Michael.
Michael. Noble.
So the issue is not the renewables. The issue is the power market design. What we should be doing when it's very, very windy in those, in the north, and we've got that offshore wind or onshore or solar during the summer, even in Scotland, we do have that. We don't have enough transmission north to south. So what we should be doing is dumping that cheap electricity on consumers and businesses in the north of the country. We should drop the price and let that electricity be used. But we're not doing that because we've got this single power price up and down the country. So there's a big debate going on about zonal pricing. So we break up the country into different zones where when it's really windy in Scotland, instead of paying people not to generate power, which is utterly ridiculous, it is, to use Greg Jackson's word, bonkers. I think we can all agree on that. I can agree on that. And it's, by the way, it is going to go to billions and multiple billions. But instead of that, what we should be doing is letting that cheap electricity get to market. And of course,
why don't we?
Because we've got a power market design, which is archaic. And by the way, but it's being lobbied. There's a huge amount of lobbying by generators because they love it. If you think about it, if you're a generator and you're being paid this elevated, gas electricity price right across everything you generate, it doesn't cost you that. You're making huge profits.
The wind operators, the renewable operators, they love it too because they're making excess profits, and that's outrageous.
So because
they get their contract for difference. They get the same amount. They get the contract for difference.
If they've signed the option, which most of them haven't.
So we can get as very technical. We don't need to. But the point is, we need to break that link. We break the country into zones. We dump the cheap electricity onto people. And by the way, that reduces the number of those pylons that you have to build, which Adrian doesn't want to build.
Nor do I.
Richard wants to bury at vast cost.
Just send the cable around the undersea.
We should do that as well. We
agree.
But we'd do less of that at lower cost if we actually had a market that functioned, that provided price
Adrian,
signals.
do you agree with this? And if you do, what pressure can you put on Ed Miliband to do what Michael's suggesting?
Well, I agree with a lot of Michael's analysis about the problems with the energy market, including the problem about gas and electricity prices being linked. It should not be the case that the price of gas determines the price of electricity, and we need to make sure that as we seek to electrify more things, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's electric cars, that is affordable for people. So there's a lot of market changes that need to happen.
Can I ask, Adrian, does the Green Party therefore support zonal pricing? Because when you go to zones, gas will set the price for fewer hours than it currently does, and the electricity prices to consumers and to businesses will drop. So do you support that?
I'm not sure our general election manifesto was as specific as that, to be honest, but what I have supported is things like removing the middleman from the electricity market. So if you've got community renewable energy, it's easier to sell directly from the producer to the consumer.
You've got to,
it sounds eminently sensible.
But Michael, you have got a demand and supply mismatch because you've got so much electricity being generated on wind farms offshore in Scotland, and you just haven't got the demand for it. So you've got huge transmission, and there's a cost of that. There's a loss of electricity. A certain percentage gets lost along the way. So there are major issues there.
But can you explain why it is that Scotland has more expensive electricity than Finland? Right? Finland has got the cheapest electricity in Europe. And what's happening is demand is arriving. Data centres are being built in Finland.
Yeah, and
right?
they won't be built here because of the cost of our electricity.
Well, right, exactly. So we agree. This is where, I started by agreeing that electricity or energy costs are going to be the big issue for coming, not just one election, but multiple. I just disagree with the diagnosis that it's something to do with net zero. It isn't. It's got nothing to do with net zero. It's got to do with over-dependence on gas and a poorly structured power market. Those are the things that we should be fixing. The idea that we're going to get resilience and that we're going to have this kind of marvellous sort of low cost of energy. We've heard the North Sea is 80% depleted. The fracking is going to produce a couple of years of energy for Europe.
We've got so much shale gas. We've got huge American companies wanting to come here because we've got so much of it. Let's fix the problems we have and not mislead people in a diagnosis which is downright misleading is saying
wrong.
that renewable energy is cheaper than nuclear energy and gas. That's the misleading that's going on.
We can do nuclear as well if you want. I have a nuclear engineering background, but
we can agree on that as well.
No doubt about the costs of nuclear. Absolutely none.
Should we go to our fun question? It's from Jackie in Peacehaven, who says, in the spirit of wanting to recycle, what's the best second-hand item you've ever bought? Is it your tie, Adrian?
That's very rude.
I'm assuming that's a compliment, Ian, because I was going to highlight, actually, I can think of lots of furniture in particular. I've got really good furniture second-hand and good to support the charity shops whilst you're doing that. So, lots of examples of furniture.
Michael?
I could really kind of surprise you in my answer because you said that you can't predict what I'm going to say. It's my 4.4 litre V8 Volvo XC90, which is now approaching 17 years old. She's a very old lady, but she still does get me to the Alps without having to stop for charging, without range anxiety. So I'm hanging on to her for a little bit longer. It was a magnificent purchase.
Would you change to electric?
Oh, yes. Yeah, as soon as you get... The range needs to be just probably a little bit longer so that I can get down to the Alps in... with one long stop, not two.
First world problem. That's what
100%. 100%.
Tessa.
I could name other things that I bought second hand, but I won't. They would be boring.
I had an armchair delivered via eBay just this morning, so it's
an armchair.
It's already my favourite piece of furniture in the house, and I think I'll be fighting with my husband for access to it. But it's top of mind. I'm not sure it's the absolute favourite thing I've ever bought secondhand, but it's very comfortable.
For me, actually, it was also on eBay, a Boardman bike that I've still got. But the most financially successful was actually buying secondhand VWs for the kids. That's proven very successful.
Can you beat my, at the age of 15, buying a second-hand cinema screen at a farmer's auction for £1, which I then sold at the age of 15 for £110 in 1977, which would be probably about £1,000 now.
Wow, you see?
So the profit margin there, I think, was quite...
The entrepreneur.
Very entrepreneurial.
Yeah. And then what happened?
No idea. I became a radio presenter. Listen, I think it's been a great hour. Thank you all so much for joining in the spirit that you have done so. Tomorrow we have the Lib Dem MP and Health Committee Chair Layla Moran, barrister and former Tory Justice Secretary Sir Robert Buckland, the businessman and former MP Lance Foreman, and the comedian and journalist Ava Vidal. I always get her first name wrong. I apologise. I'll do it again tomorrow, I'm sure. Right, in the next hour, I want to know how often you argue with your partner. Yeah, I'm nosy like that. Because George Clooney reckons that he and his wife, Amal, have never had an argument in 11 years of marriage. I know what he means, because in 30 years of being with my partner, we've never had a real sort of shouty match argument. We've never had a thing like a door slamming one where you're effing and seeing seeing all the time, which I'm looking around the panel here and everyone's looking completely bemused. Well, you say how dull, but quite peaceful. I'm wondering if that is the secret of a good marriage, a good partnership, where you never row. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the International Monetary Fund has cut its forecast for UK growth this year to 1.1%. The IMF says Donald Trump's trade tariffs and the disruption they're causing is affecting economic performance worldwide. But its chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Garinchard, says domestic issues are also having an impact.
And in particular, there is a lower carryover